and welcome to the APICS webinar, Beyond the Horizon, Surviving and Thriving in the Increasingly Complex World of Supply Chain, with Stanley E. Griffiths and Kelly M. Lynch. My name is Jennifer Storelli, Associate Editor at APICS. We're glad all of you could make it today and appreciate your patience with us after last week's technical difficulties. We apologize for any inconvenience that caused. Please note this presentation is being recorded and will be available at apics.org/online events starting early next week. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we will save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click send. Should you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Tech Support at 1-805-617-7000. Again, that's 1-805-617-7000. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to add my thanks to everybody that's joining and rejoining us here for this webinar. This webinar is going to be Beyond the Horizon, Surviving and Thriving in the Increasingly Complex World of Supply Chain. It is a joint project between APICS and the MSU Beyond the Horizon Supply Chain team, and we're really happy that all of you have joined us today. I'm Stan Griffiths, one of your presenters today. I'm a professor of logistics at the Eli Broad College of Business at Michigan State University, and as you can see on the screen, we've got some contact information. So if there's any need to contact us after the webinar, ask some follow-up questions, or other ideas about the research, you're more than welcome to do so here.
Thank you, Stan. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kelly Lynch, and I'm the Director of Purchasing and Supplier Quality Operations and Integration at Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, or FCA US LLC. And as you can see, I've got contact information as well.
So that's who will be on your webinar today, Kelly and I. And what I'd like to do now is just kind of cover very briefly what the structure of the webinar will look like so you'll know where we're going. First couple of minutes here, I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of a backdrop against the project Beyond the Horizon, the partnership between MSU and APICS. So we'll talk about that, how we've come up with the information that we're presenting to you today. And then we're going to roll into our topic. We've got it listed as supply chain complexity, but within that, we'll be talking about globalization, risk management, and supply continuity that's related to that. We're going to address some issues on resiliency, and I'll also be talking about SKU proliferation. The way we're going to go about that is we're going to kind of go back and forth between Kelly and myself. Each of the two sections, we're going to talk about some of the challenges that are present in these areas within complexity. And then we'll shift gears and we'll start looking a little bit more forward. What are some of the approaches to dealing with these types of complexity? And then at the end of it, we'll have about 10-15 minute period of time where if you have any questions, you want to go ahead and put those into the system, and Kelly and I will be able to go ahead and try and address those with you and wrap it up at the end of that. So as I mentioned, this webinar is one of a series of products, webinars, white papers, and infographics between APICS and Michigan State University. You'll see this logo here whenever you're getting information from the Beyond the Horizon project. With regard to that Beyond the Horizon project, from a big picture perspective, let me go ahead and briefly cover what the project has been looking at. We've really been going after three main questions for a couple of years now. The first of those is, how is supply chain management becoming a strategic asset? How is it being used within corporations to create value in ways that typically supply chain has not been tasked to do? Rather, it's often been looked to fulfill performance, but not to actually create new types of value. And so that was one of the questions we had as we were working with our research partners. How is supply chain turning into a strategic value driving type of an asset? The next of the broad-reaching questions we've been asking is, what are some of the trends and developments that are shaping the future of the supply chain? The name of the project is Beyond the Horizon, and it's meant to imply that we're trying to look a little further out into the future than often some of the type of research that makes it out into the field does. It's a little bit more backward looking. So we're trying to see, over that next hill, talking with companies and finding out what they're working on. And then the last broad question we've had is, what are some of the things that the companies have done that have made them successful in making supply chain management strategic? What are the tools? What are the systems? What are the practices that, as we talk with multiple different companies, we begin to see a pattern so that we can pass that on through the research? As far as the team is concerned, we've got a fairly large team of researchers here at Michigan State that are working on this project. You can see all their names here. I'm not going to go through them. Some of you probably know some of these people, but these are the folks that have been out performing the interviews with the companies, pulling that data together and beginning to interpret that. And they're always there if you've got contact information for any of them, if you'd like to go ahead and discuss the research with them or get into the APICS organization so that you can then get more detail on any of this. As far as an outline of the overall research project itself in the more detailed area rather than those earlier broad questions that we talked about, this is what we've been doing in the last couple of years. We've gone ahead and interviewed over 50 medium and large size firms. We've had a very global perspective in these interviews. We've interviewed companies North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and we've also been looking at a broad base of types of supply chains. We've looked at manufacturing, we've looked at retail, we've looked at service industries. And as I say, we've now started to pull all that together and been able to put it into formats here with APICS to try and get that knowledge out to the membership. In addition to those 50-plus interviews, we've also done 3 different day-long industry roundtable meetings where we've been talking with different companies that have attended these about what they're seeing on a little bit more of a one-on-one basis, and then also allowing some interaction between the companies to hear what the different organizations are dealing with in a bit more of a dynamic environment. Some of the things that we've discussed, you can see there a list of them, everything from environment to strategic initiatives, different supply chain practices, how measurement of performance is accomplished, how strategy is formulated, so very broad-reaching topics. And in some cases, we get very deep. Other times, it's a little bit broader and more strategic. As far as the method of gathering of this data is concerned, as mentioned, we've kind of done this through interviews that we've then recorded. We've taken those and done content analysis of those results, and we're pulling out patterns and then working with our industry partners through these roundtables and other things to clarify and sharpen those results. So, to today's topics, we're going to break this out into 2 different areas, if you will. We're first going to talk about sources and types of complexity, some of those, again, being globalization, risk management, supply continuity, resiliency, SKU proliferation. And what we'll do is I'm going to go through and talk about what we saw coming straight out of the research, and then I'm going to hand it over to Kelly, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about Fiat Chrysler America's perspective on what they're seeing in the way of sources and types of complexity that they're dealing with. Then we'll shift gears and we'll talk to approaches for dealing with these types of complexity, and again, it'll have the same pattern. I'll go ahead and walk you through what we've seen in the research and talking with the companies and having those interviews, having those roundtable meetings, and then Kelly will go ahead and come back in and he'll talk to you about how FCA is going about dealing with these types of complexity. Then at the end of all of that, what we'll do is we'll shift back over into a Q&A session, and for the last 10, 15 minutes or so of the webinar, Kelly and I will go ahead and try and address the questions that you'll have submitted through the webinar. So one of the first types of complexity that we're going to talk about is a general category of complexity driven by customer accommodation. And there's a number of different types of customer accommodation that you can see listed here. We'll walk through each of those in turn. The first that I want to go ahead and discuss that we've heard about is that of expectations of speed in the eyes of the consumer. And what we heard is that this is rising and doesn't seem to be slowing down, that the expectations are ever increasing. Now, additional speed on its own doesn't necessarily mean complexity, but in addition to the desire for speed, we're also hearing that varying speed offerings is something that customers desire. A 1-day, a 3-day, a 5-day service. And so it's not just only faster all the time, but greater range of options is causing that complexity to go ahead and rise. Further, while speed is universally desired, precision is also critical, especially in the B2B markets with business customers. Hitting those tight delivery windows is operationally more complex than merely getting it there faster. And this causes the complexity of sequencing and accomplishing the variety of tasks necessary to deliver quickly within a tight time window to also go up. As far as visibility, in addition to that desired speed, what we were hearing is that customers have become accustomed to this increased visibility that they have. So like speed, this adds complexity in staying on top of the product's status and location, especially as we're talking more and more about censored supply chains as a common thing, and the dynamic decision-making that can start to come from these types of supply chains. Again, just another layer of that complexity. The other customer accommodation area we've heard quite a bit about is product and service assortment. And we could probably talk for an entire webinar on nothing more than SKU proliferation and how that adds to the asset investment in a company, but we're not going to go ahead and do that today. But essentially, what we saw is that as you start to divide that aggregate demand into smaller and smaller sections and address each with a distinct product offering, you're going to have an increase in the variance of the demand for each of those narrowly cast products. So if you think about toothpaste, 25 years ago, there were 2 or 3 flavors from each company. Now, not only are there 7 or 8 flavors with different additives, but there's different sizes. And so as you take that aggregate demand and you slice it narrower and narrower, the variance goes up for each one of those products, which starts to create challenges for the rest of the supply chain. So the added complexity of that demand forecasting and the disaggregation of the distribution, because now instead of 7 pallets, of product A, we've got 15 quarter-size pallets for ABC through whatever number it's going to be. And so this assortment creates complexity because we're addressing a smaller and smaller set of demand with each, and that challenges our systems. The next of these customer accommodation complicating factors is that of product customization. So in addition to offering more make-to-stock products, the effect of allowing additional customization by the customer increases the complexity into our supply chain. And so that complexity is less felt on the inventory investment, like the example I talked about in those make-to-stock products a moment ago, but more in the internal process complexity. So to offer those different product and service customizations, we have to redesign our processes to respond to more than just that simple customer demand variable. We've now got to respond to what it is that they want in addition to when they want it, how they want it. And again, we're breaking this into smaller and smaller pieces, and that's where our challenges come from. And then lastly, in the customer accommodation area, we talked with the companies about omni-channel supply chains. Anyone with final touch to the customer has seen this issue's development in the last few years. And as consumers, we want unbridled flexibility in where we receive our products and service, as well as where we return them when we deem them not to meet our expectations. And so we heard from companies that years ago, they kept their brick and mortar and online inventories separate, and the SKUs were different, formats, lengths, so that they would be able to tell how these different products were getting to them. They could then dispatch them accordingly. But with saleable inventory returned to the stores now, there's a benefit to being able to go ahead and sell those things. What is the impact of ordering process of an unexpected inventory showing up? So we've now got inventory coming back into our brick and mortar stores that was not ordered for them. It's an online return. Well, that changes the inventory that's at that location. It disrupts the ordering profile that we may have been setting up. And so the ability to deal with issues like this amplified variation, it can be problematic if unaccounted for, and this was one of the issues that we heard from our companies. The next of our complexity sources that I'm going to talk about is that of the globalization of operations. And as we looked into this, it really broke into two different types of globalization: the customer-facing globalization challenges and the supply-facing globalization challenges. So let's first talk about those customer-facing ones. One of the things that we heard from a number of different companies was that as they are moving into areas that they've not necessarily been in the past, they need to go ahead and focus the produce, product assortment, a number of different things to the local demographic of what that population is looking for, and that this creates a challenge for the supply chain. So instead of 60 stores all getting the exact same thing in a region, if you've got demographics in certain areas that are looking for different product, you can't give everyone that same assortment. So you start to manage these more like local stores rather than managing them like a national or an international supply chain. And that increases the challenges for the organization. The second of these is the locational complexity. And so this is the challenge of moving into space that maybe is not the home area for a company. As access to our products opens up with Internet's ability to put things before ever expanding marketplaces, the breadth of those supply chain operations has to expand to meet the needs of those new customers. And so how you address those customers' demand may not be the same way you've addressed customer demand in the past. So as that occurs, our logistical tail grows, obviously, and it causes us to bring in additional supply chain partners, additional relationships, new contracts, and again, back to this complexity issue, each of these things to take care of those customers adds the complexity. And then in the last of the customer-facing areas, again, as we globalize our operations and move into places, we start to bump into some legal and regulatory things that maybe we haven't seen in the past. And part of the challenge here is that not only might they be things that we haven't seen in the past, but they may also be somewhat fluid. There's ever-changing legal and regulatory environments that you operate within, as we've just very recently seen with the Brexit vote from the UK. The package of rules, regulations, and requirements to operate in the UK and the EU now are going to be different, whereas in the past, if you were, in the example of a North American company, moving into the European market, you at least had a simpler bit of calculus to go through, because at least there was one set of rules for all those EU nations. Now, if you want to continue to operate with the UK, there's going to be a different set of rules in that regard. So now, on the supply side, things aren't a whole lot easier. So let's talk about this first one, this local sourcing complexity. So for either regulatory or economic reasons, going global typically means that you're not going to be able to just simply ship things around the world from your home market. All right, what we're seeing is that these global supply chains that we interacted with in the research talked about the complexity associated with local sourcing and how serious of an issue that is for those markets that they're coming into. Developing suppliers outside the home market, bringing those into your supply chain, all while dealing with differences in quality, be it material quality or process quality, was an issue that numerous companies were dealing with. Creating the systems to make that work were a huge complicating factor for each of the different markets that they developed into, and then maintaining the ability to deal with those issues while managing a, if you will, worldview was not seen as something that was easy or straightforward. As it relates to cultural complexity, as you start doing business in different areas, there's going to be different business norms, the way you interact with the community, local specific factors. Each of these are things which are going to need to be dealt with. And then lastly, on the supply complexity issue of globalization, our respondents mentioned that the vast breadth and distance that they were dealing with, that as that supply chain expanded, the ability to meet tight time windows was a bit of a challenge for them. Another category of complexity-inducing factors for supply chains was internal and external environmental factors. And these are factors that are influenced by broader business trends, independent of the specific choices that the company might be making and how to address either their customer or supply base. And let me go through those. The first of them is process complexity, and this often leads to specialized suppliers, which often restricts options in the future, which inherently complicates things. In a way, it can be viewed as a complexity reducer because there is less searching for suppliers necessary, but at the same time, complexity challenge shifts over to maintaining the ability to be flexible and responsive despite having fewer options for sources because you've gone ahead and gotten in with a smaller group. As far as technology turnover, I think we've all heard about Moore's laws and its impact on any number of different technological issues. With regard to supply chains, the break-even on these investments typically extends far beyond the next Moore's law cycle, which means that we're almost always going to be operating with technology of varying vintages. Getting these systems to operate together, whether they're all ours or shared interactions between us and our suppliers or our customers, is a factor which is making things challenging out in the supply chain. Another issue is that of increasing supply chain management scope. The responsibilities of the supply chain are also growing. Long ago, getting product to the customer, hey, that was enough, but now we need to continue to do that while also establishing and maintaining efficient approaches for customer accommodation and returns, be they retail-based, end-of-life, or closed-loop supply chain. But these things are now becoming part of supply chain responsibility where they haven't necessarily always been in the past. And then the last of these business-driven factors is the issue of mergers and acquisitions came up. And this also drives complexity within the supply chain. We spoke to companies that through various different M&As had gotten to the point where they had dozens of distinct ERP implementations that all needed to somehow figure out how to work together, all while more business units were continuing to be added as time progressed. So the analogy that we heard was, it's kind of like trying to change tires on the truck at speed going down the highway, all the while picking up more freight along the way. And so these different implementations that are brought on by these M&A type of activities are something which are complicating issues. The next of these business or supply chain driven complexity factors is that of collateral complexity. So this complexity factor was mentioned by companies because a number of them were seeing complexity rise due to good business decisions that unfortunately longer term made things hard on the supply chain. And it wasn't an uncommon complaint to supply chain managers, but the push to omni-channel appears to be bringing additional further complicating issues in this regard. While the customer is delighted at the flexibility to do things like order online and return in person, organizing the supply chain to allow this is less straightforward than it used to be. The topic of operational efficiency and the decisions that they drive kind of parallels this somewhat, and that there are some collateral impacts to these decisions within the supply chain. So as an example, make to stock versus make to order decisions for internal efficiency reasons also creates complexity for the rest of the supply chain that need to be considered up front. If for no other reason than the likelihood of the decisions ultimately falling to a single decision maker, that gives us a chance to decide where we'll want to bleed, if you will. And then lastly, the broad economic and regulatory trends distinct from those discussed in the global part just a couple of moments ago are always going to affect the supply chain and cause us to have to deal with their consequences. As domestic business cycles and regulatory influences ebb and flow, the supply chain needs to account for these types of factors as well, given the supply chain's role as a boundary spanning function for the firm. So that's what we've heard through the research, some of the things that are driving complexity in people's supply chains. And so what I'd like to do now is hand it off to Kelly Lynch of Fiat Chrysler America, and he's going to talk to you about his perspective on some of these sources and types of complexity and what FCA is experiencing.
Thanks, Dan. First, I want to thank MSU and APICS for working with FCA Chrysler over the past few years on the Beyond the Horizons project. This has been very informative and rewarding to FCA to have been actively involved in this project. I would like to take a few seconds to let people know about Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, FCA, in the event that people engaged in this webinar are not familiar with my company. FCA as a whole has 15 commercial brands and has operations in 40 countries with sales in 2015 of 110 billion euros in over 150 nations and markets. FCA employs approximately 240,000 people and it shipped 4.6 million vehicles last year. The focus of this discussion will be on automotive sales and services globally for FCA. At FCA, the purchasing function and the supplier quality function are under one roof. We consider that to be a key to ensure that our suppliers understand that product quality is the #1 objective that we expect of our suppliers day in and day out. And there's more to come on that later. As you can see, we have established a vision statement for our organization, and it is critical for how we want to do business with our suppliers, that everything we do with this vision in mind. In support of our vision statement, FCA adapted in 2010 our foundational principles. The most important takeaway from this slide is the foundational principles is a two-way street. This is not only what we expect from our suppliers, but is also what we expect of each employee of FCA when they are dealing with one of our suppliers. These words and these definitions are powerful, and we have high expectations of ourselves as well as our supplier partners. Please take a moment to look at this. We do not take these lightly, and these are not just buzzwords. Stan will speak later in the webinar about the importance of supplier relationships. It is not hokey, and it is not touchy-feely. It is more than that. We all have to remember that when big companies interact with each other on hundreds or thousands of transactions and meetings on a daily basis, it always comes down to human interaction. Our objective at FCA is that we ultimately utilize and leverage our suppliers' expertise and capability to provide us a competitive advantage. I'm convinced that it can be done, and it will be done as we progress on our journey. One quick point on this slide. Notice that we do not mention the word cost. That is intentional. Lowest price does not equal lowest total cost. If our job at FCA purchasing was just to pick the lowest quote supplier, then we would not need all of these highly compensated MSU supply chain management graduates that we hire every year. The environment has changed in the automotive landscape over the course of the past 20 years or so, and the pace of change is quicker than it ever has been. A myopic focus on price from the purchasing department will ultimately result in higher costs elsewhere, such as logistics, warranty, G&A expenditures for things such as travel, to contain vehicles, and ultimately will cost us in terms of customer satisfaction and vehicle purchases. The next few slides are additional background that should provide you with information about the scope of the challenge that we face at FCA in the production and distribution of passenger cars, trucks, and commercial vehicles. The challenges that FCA faces in terms of supply chain sustainability and complexity are not unique to my company. I may be biased. Actually, I will admit that I am biased, but I sincerely believe that the automotive industry is unique in its level of complexity, and our ability to orchestrate the supply chain to support us as a whole is pretty amazing. I won't spend a great deal of time on each slide, but I would like to ask each of our webinar participants to think about a car or truck, the kind of vehicles you see every day in your driveway, on your commutes to and from work, on your errands, and used in so many different ways by so many different people. Commuters, car enthusiasts, farmers, construction workers, taking the kids to who knows where, delivery, and other commercial vehicles. I could go on and on. The average car has about 3,500 parts on it, depending on how you count. So think about it. If we just build 1,000 cars per day at an assembly plant, that means we take delivery of 3.5 million parts per day. So far, so good. That seems pretty daunting in and of itself. But then think about the ripple effect through the entire supply chain. For example, every car, minivan, or truck on the road today has exterior or side view mirrors. Oftentimes, there will be 3 to 5 trim levels for each vehicle, and this impacts our supply chain and drives complexity management. Entry-level vehicles will have basic functionality. The more expensive you go, the more complex you get. For example, some mirrors will be painted to match the body color of the car. Some will be chromed. Some will be equipped with safety features, like a car in your blind spot, and some will not. And I think you get the picture. Our mirror supplier will definitely send us 2,000 mirrors each day. But the question is the mix and the challenge of managing all the SKUs and getting the parts shipped to our facilities just in time to support our build while minimizing inventory levels. It is not an exaggeration to say that in some instances there can be millions of build permutations for any given vehicle. Moving on, this slide demonstrates the locations and staffing levels of the purchasing and supplier quality function worldwide. FCA globally purchases over $80 billion in goods and services from our suppliers. Quickly, on supplier quality, FCA has a rigorous quality planning process that we work through on every purchase part with our suppliers to ensure that we will have a statistically demonstrated manufacturing process in place that will repeatedly produce parts within specifications and tolerances. A little over 75% of the content of our vehicles comes from our supplier partners. We cannot succeed without our supply base, period. These next two slides simply demonstrate how we are organized to manage our buys. The car is broken down into 6 distinctive groups, and our purchasing and supplier quality function is organized along the same lines as our engineering function. This is the case in NAFTA as well as globally. People don't often think about the scope or scale of our buy outside of parts that are sent to our assembly and other manufacturing plants. FCA spends billions of dollars on capital expenditures, indirect materials, and services. When it comes to services, think about our Super Bowl advertisements, all the way to Mopar for service parts and accessories. I'm going to turn it over to Stan now because it's time to review how companies approach and manage the complexity of their unique supply chains, automotive or otherwise.
Thanks, Kelly. It's interesting to hear about the specifics that FCA is dealing with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and now start talking about what we're seeing in the research as it relates to how people are dealing with complexity, some of the approaches that they're taking in dealing with these. You see, I'm going to go through, I've got some stuff here on avoidance, although with a note about caution. One of the other things we've heard about is the value of partnering, some stuff on technology and information, as well as flexible workforce and a few other things. So the first of these, so the leading approach that we heard for addressing complexity was, possibly unsurprisingly, avoid it in the first place. Now, not that anyone thought that this was an easy approach, but they did have some ideas on how to avoid it in the first place. Chief among those was to be more aware as to where those complexities were rising from. Actually, some of the issues that I discussed earlier, but then follow that up by working internally with the supply chain organization, getting them on board early enough, early as possible, in situations where they might help create options to deliver whatever ultimately might be needed without unnecessarily creating complexity for the supply chain. And this is not going to be a magic Band-Aid, but the earlier supply chain could be brought in on some of these things, it was felt the earlier they'd be able to help address those problems. Related to this was a strong advocacy for understanding the ways in which the supply chain creates either internal or external value propositions and insulating these value propositions from the negative effects of unneeded complexity, or worse yet, eroding the value proposition on the way to reducing complexity elsewhere. One unfortunate situation we heard about was companies working to reduce complexity and as a result negatively affecting the supply chain value stream, making things worse rather than better. Broadly speaking, it's always an important discussion for the supply chain folks to have with others within the company at business level, strategy, about objectives and processes being modified to make sure that we in the supply chain are still able to deliver value to our internal and external customers throughout that change under this new approach. One of our research participants also had a fair amount to say about their supply chain partners as it relates to complexity. Again, while it's possibly obvious of a recommendation on the surface, they found that better partners in the relationship make it easier to deal with or limit the supply chain complexity that they felt. Now, specifically, they discussed ways good partners help them deal with complexity through enhancing their product and process innovation. Within these two types, there's actually two different levels, if you will, of innovation. The first being incremental innovation, and good partners who you've already worked with can usually help you here the most. Here's why. Our current partners grow to understand our processes. They get to the point where they know our operations well enough to understand them implicitly. And so they're able to help us with incremental innovations. But because they're outside of our firm, they also have other experiences that allow them to offer suggestions as to how we might tweak things, again, product or process, to improve the output that we're getting out of that, and in a way, hopefully keep that complexity down. So that's on this incremental innovation and how our partners can help us with that. The second type of innovation is radical innovation, and this type is going to be tougher to secure and internalize. And in part, this is because it's been shown that radical innovation is less likely to come from our close partners, those who we've got this long-standing thing I talked about, the you read my mind, I'll read yours kind of relationship that comes from familiarity. And the reason for this is it's possible that those type of partners, the ones we really know well, we've possibly become too close and maybe even too alike. So think about it. Novelty in thought isn't necessarily going to come from someone that you've known forever. It's going to come from outside of your normal circle. That close circle around us knows us really well, thinks more like we do, and things like that. And they're less likely to have some earth-shattering different idea. So back out to our supply chain perspective, what does this mean? Well, what it means is that when you need radical change to reduce complexity or any number of other reasons, you're probably going to need to look beyond your normal group and find a good partner that isn't just like you. They don't know everything about how you operate, and they're going to be able to bring you much more novel experience, information, perspective that might jar your system into a newer, better state. So let's move on here to technology and information. Regarding this area, our research partner companies definitely saw technology as a way forward in reducing complexity, specifically as it's related to process simplification through the use of technology. However, they cautioned us that you've got to be careful that technology for technology's sake often ends badly, but that when we look at our technology and our process and how well they fit together, some pretty powerful outcomes can be obtained. On the flexible workforce topic here, the companies we talked to were all desiring more flexible workforces to allow them to simplify their operations to reduce complexity. And wherever possible, these companies are trying to develop talents that are multi-skilled in hopes of reducing handoffs between workers and create opportunities or reduce opportunities for breakdowns to occur. While staffs full of jack of all trades don't seem to be on anyone's horizons, many spoke of the desire to reduce complications through skilled, flexible talent. Against this backdrop, though, many observed that good supply chain talent is still hard to find and even harder to retain. So we won't dive specifically into that in this webinar. That is an area of the research that's come out of Beyond the Horizons that I'm sure you can access on APICS's website. But what we have seen is that there is still a consistent desire and move towards better and more flexible workforce. The last couple of areas that I will talk about coming out of the research on dealing with complexity before I pass it back to Kelly to talk about FCA and their experience and view on this is about supplier collaboration and trust and value in collaboration within the supply chain. So you'll see that the first sub-bullet is a quote here from one of our research participants, and as they say, it sounds hokey, but work with good people. Well, specifically, here they were talking about their suppliers and how they strove to build integrity across the relationship, promote transparency to the maximum degree that they could across that partnership, and foster trust between themselves and their partners. Now, they conceded that it was not easy and that the almighty dollar ultimately has its say. But they and the other participants in the room did all come back and say that long term, you've got to have the profitability, there's got to be business reasons for people to be working together, but that when you're working with suppliers, you've got to work with good people that interface well with your organization and vice versa, and that without that, long term, you were probably going to see costs go up because the relationship wasn't right. You weren't working with good people. Next, we heard that having the right people in the room at the right time is critical. And there's times in relationships, they told us, that you just have to have the right people in the room. In particular, let's say early on, At certain meetings, the right people have to be there. At other waypoints, when the CEO needs to be in the room for that critical decision, that strategic direction in a partnership, they need to be in the room at the right time. They can't be hanging around all the time, nor do they have the ability to. But at certain points and at certain times, they're going to need to be there to set the tone and lead the organization. Similarly, when we get down to director levels and on down to the working level managers, you've got to have the right people in the room for the right decision at the right time, and then they need to clear out and let the other folks at that next level down do the work that's necessary for them to make sure that everything is working correctly. Also related to our supplier collaboration, we heard the complexity is reduced when we better understand how our processes affect our suppliers. Some of the participants in the research related that they have suppliers that are negatively impacted by the way the customer was working, sending things to their supplier, causing their supplier's operations to be disrupted because they didn't really understand how sending in something late, sending in something early, a slight configuration mistake was impacting that supplier. And so on the customer side, they talked about the importance of understanding the supplier's operations and how our interface with them either eases complexity or makes things more difficult to try and become that good customer that we want to be. Conversely, we also heard that the suppliers needed to better understand how their output, that product or service, was integrated into the overall value proposition of the final good or service, and that when they better understood their role in the ultimate output creation, value creation, they'd be better positioned to help deliver the best possible product and to do that in a way that smoothed the flow and reduced complexity along the way. And so, again, this needs to be more than a pure arm's length relationship. In all cases, there's going to be times with some of your suppliers and some of your customers where that deeper level of relationship to understand how you affect that supplier or customer and vice versa, and how that affects overall. One of the next things that our research partners talked about is the question of what's a review. And this was an interesting outcome that surprising number of the participants talked about. We heard about suppliers showing up for reviews that turned out to be fairly informal events, and they'd spent far too much time and effort documenting any number of different things, only to have issues complicated for themselves in the eye of the reviewing customers. Then we also heard just the opposite, customers attending a review where a supplier hadn't done enough to promote visibility and the insight that that customer desired when they came for that review. And so essentially in both cases it came down to the same thing, and that is discuss up front what the frequency, format, depth, formality, and expectations of reviews were. Now, for firms and companies that we've been working with for a while, this is less of an issue because we've come to understand those things. But certainly as we globalize and move into different areas, we bring different suppliers into organization, these types of issues we need to remind ourselves may not be top of mind for either one side of the equation or the other. We'll need to discuss those factors ahead of time so that it's a more productive meeting and review overall for everyone. Respondents were also mentioning that their supply chains are successful at reducing complexity in cases where the reward system was well organized, people understood what would or would not be possible within that, and that the benefits were better understood across the relationship. So having that kind of like the review, knowing what is going to be expected, should I be waiting for something or not, having that agreed to up front helped overall with dealing with the supply chain complexity issue. As far as overall this trust and value and collaboration, our research participants agreed that without a long-term focus, trust and value sharing in the supply chain relationships was not going to happen. If you're beating the value out of your supply chain partners rather than working to mutually create that value, the customers we talked to said that relationship is probably not going to be durable, and that while you may get some benefit, in the long run, you're going to end up having to turn that supplier or that customer over. You're You're going to have to bring somebody new in, get them to understand how you operate. You're going to have to figure out how they operate, and that long term, you may be hurting the overall value proposition. So I've talked long enough about what we heard from the companies under the research. Let me go ahead and throw it back to Kelly from FCA, and he can talk about things that they're seeing in the way of mitigating these complexity challenges.
At FCA, we do not think of supply chain complexity without taking into consideration supply chain sustainability. In our minds, they are inseparable. Sustainability consists of three elements which must be balanced for an organization to be truly sustainable. Environment, safeguarding the environment and natural resources. Social, the people aspect, which includes employees, suppliers, dealers, the community, and all other stakeholders. Governance, corporate governance, ethics, financial stability, and all of the contributing factors. For purposes of our discussion today, governance is our focal point. We have to know to the greatest extent possible who we are dealing with at all tiers of the supply chain. As we progress through the animation on this slide, the theory is very clear. You should feasibly be able to map your supply chain all the way down to a hole in the ground, a concept that I learned about at MSU when I was at graduate school there in the late 1980s. Think about it. Wouldn't it be great for people in a steel factory to know that the quality of the parts and materials they produce will end up in a part that is on a vehicle that one of their family members is driving that is involved in a collision? Do you think those people would be more attentive to detail about conformance to specifications and timely delivery of parts if they knew about the potential impact to their daily lives? I contend that they would, but it would be unrealistic for FCA to expect otherwise. Or would it? FCA has been actively involved with the Automotive Industry Action Group and other OEMs to see if we can arrive at an industry-wide solution to supply chain mapping and understanding. This has been very difficult. Mapping your supply chain at the Tier 1 level is easy. As you get deeper into the tiers, it gets exponentially more difficult. As you can see from our sustainability survey, many of our Tier 1 suppliers were surprised that they were actually managing a supply chain that was global in scope. And when you get into lower tiers of supply chain, these companies had no idea that their materials and or parts were used in the production of automobiles for FCA and other OEMs. This is probably a bad analogy, but I'm going to use it anyway. Mapping your supply chain is like buying an iPhone. You are very happy about getting an iPhone 6. You have the latest and greatest technology that Apple has to offer at this point in time. But you know in the back of your mind that Apple is ready to launch an iPhone 6s at about the same time next year. They have an iPhone 7, 8, and 9 already on the drawing board. Your iPhone 6 is obsolete the second that you purchase it, and your supply chain map is obsolete the second that you complete it. This is our challenge, and I'm not sure how we are going to solve this, but we are diligently working on solutions. If you recall the last slide that Stan showed and spoke to, he addressed the importance of trust and collaboration. We at FCA have made a public commitment to our suppliers that we truly do value supplier relationships, and we are dedicated to making our relationships with our supplier partners better than today with an eye towards the future. Our suppliers are generally committed to our success. We just have to address their concerns and make doing business between ourselves and themselves as easy as possible. The onus is on FCA to own this, and we do. We have identified several projects we are undertaking globally with the help of our suppliers to make measurable improvements. For example, FCA US did not have enough returnable containers in our distribution network, and it meant that our suppliers would have to either ship in cardboard or would pack parts in cardboard containers and repack them in the returnable containers when they arrived at their facility. As a result, FCA US spent in excess of $10 million to place more containers in the system, and this is only one of several changes that we made to improve this situation between ourselves and our suppliers on this front. Finally, we know that better supplier relationships yield quantitative results in terms of part quality and lower costs, but also in things that are harder to measure, like innovation. Suppliers will bring to their preferred customers first their new product offerings that they have because they know that their suggestions and advanced technology will be honored by their preferred customers, and the likelihood of adoption into a future car or truck is fairly high.
So if you're interested in learning more about this research or possibly even participating in the research, I'm going to leave this up here. This is the email address for the Beyond the Horizons research team. I won't try and read it. It's quite a complicated email address, but if you're interested in participating or learning more about this from the MSU side of things, this is where you can go ahead and contact us. As I mentioned before, up on APICS's website, there's a number of different Beyond the Horizons research products that have been generated or are available to you as APICS members. I'd invite you to also go and look there.
Thanks, Dan and Kelly. And now I see some time for questions and answers. As a reminder to the audience, you can type your question in the questions box at the right-hand side of your screen and click send. We'll now give you a few moments to send in your questions. Okay, our first question comes from Giorgio, and Giorgio notes that in general, their cultural differences with your suppliers can cause some issues, and so what would be the best way to improve supply chain management in these cases? Stan, I think you have some experience in this area, so would you mind talking to that a little bit?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. Actually, it's my pre-academic time, but before I came to academia, at one point I worked with U.S. industry in the embassy in Seoul, South Korea, and one of the challenges that many of the U.S. companies had was something that Giorgio is alluding to, and that is dealing with the cultural differences between South Korean companies and the U.S. companies trying to sell product in the area. One of the things that we saw that seemed to be effective in addressing those kinds of issues was that they often would, in some cases they had to by law, but in other cases just by choice, sign on with an agent company. And so this is someone who has expertise in the market area, both from experience there, but as well as with the product categories, is I guess what I mean. And that the U.S. companies would hire these agents to work with them on making sure that a lot of the cultural complexity type issues that I talked about a little bit earlier were minimized as they went to market in those different areas, so that they would not have the missteps that otherwise someone unfamiliar with it would have. And so agent companies is one thing that I've seen in the past that does this. And then once you build your own solid base of understanding of the market, you can start to pull back from those.
Great, thanks, Dan. Our next question, I think, is for Kelly. Kelly, one of our attendees wants to know, how does FCA handle recalls due to a defective part from a supplier?
I'm sorry, Jennifer, you broke up a little bit.
Oh, I'm so sorry. The question was, how does FCA handle recalls due to a defective part from a supplier?
Okay, so if we have a situation where there's either total responsibility or shared responsibility for a defective part that's supplied to us from a supplier, whether the defect is due to a design issue if the supplier was design responsible for the part, or a manufacturing issue, so for example they shipped us a part out of specification or tolerance, then we share that data with the supplier and we enter into a negotiated settlement with that supplier. As a general rule, we never name names of suppliers that are involved with any type of recall.
Great, thank you. And Kelly, I think our next question is for you as well. Robin wants to know, what are the key things that we should be reviewing with our suppliers?
Okay, well, I guess I'd answer that question in a couple of ways. If it's a supplier that we currently do business with, at least here at FCA, and I'm sure at many, many companies, we have scorecards and measurables of performance that we monitor and go through on a regular basis, and we constantly review those with our suppliers in a cross-functional manner, meaning people from purchasing, supplier quality, engineering, manufacturing, our design office, whatever the case may be. So, however, though, when it comes to like a brand new part that we're going to be manufacturing with, once we've finalized all of our negotiations with the suppliers, we have a very regimented process for advanced quality planning, as well as for a review of the supplier's proposed technical and manufacturing solution that we go through to ensure that the supplier can produce the part and has the systems and processes in place that are unique to that part or perhaps unique to a manufacturing facility, so there's no surprises. It's a fairly extensive checklist, but it is an industry standard, and if you're interested, there's a thing called the Automotive Industry Action Group, and there's a lot of information out there about advanced quality planning. So depending on the industry you're in, Robin, there could be some very, very useful information through the AIAG.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Our next question is for Stan, it's about the research, and Ingrid wants to know, increasing complexity of the supply chain most likely also will complicate forecasting processes. And so when you guys were doing the research, did the MSU team consider S&OP as a topic in the study? And if so, what was found or what are the expectations for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, as you probably saw in some of my comments when we got talking about SKU proliferation, forecasting processes and complexity was definitely something which came up. We didn't ask specifically about it per se, but it was an issue and a source of complexity that a number of the respondents shared with us. As it relates to S&OP, as the remedy to that, at the outset it was not specifically asked about either. We did try and keep things general. But in the course of some of the meetings we've subsequently had, the face-to-face discussions with the different participants, S&OP as a approach to trying to mitigate that complicating forecasting problem has definitely come up. But as far as a structured question specifically on it, Ingrid, no, that was not something that we in particular pursued as to how are you using it, what ways is it advantaged. It was really more as a from the ground up general outcome type of thing that came about.
Thanks, Dan. And I'm going to pass our next question to you as well. We had an attendee ask about mergers and acquisitions and some best practices there. They want to know, what's the best approach? Should you integrate the acquired company at the time of buy, or should you wait a few months or years and integrate later?
Boy, I don't know that I'm the most qualified M&A person to address that. We heard a fair bit about M&As. That's really probably the same type of thing that's driving Sudhir's question here, and that is, how does that increase the complexity? I sense that would probably be so specific to each company that I'm not sure I would have an answer, and I'm almost afraid to try and pitch it to Kelly because that's obviously a pretty sensitive thing. But I'm not sure that I can fully address your question.
So Stan, this is Kelly. You're pitching and I'm catching, which is okay. And this is very specific to my experiences here at Chrysler, and it's probably different for every company. But if, for example, in 1987, American Motors Corporation was acquired by Chrysler, and in that case, the decision was made that we are going to use our systems and processes, and basically the acquiring company, in this case Chrysler, kind of called all the shots. Then there was the whole Daimler-Chrysler situation that we had, which was a merger and a demerger, and in that case there was no real drive towards a lot of global processes and centralized system work. And so when the demerger, if that's the right word for it, happened, there was very little consequence. And now we've got Fiat Chrysler automobiles, and in this case we are doing our best to have global systems and global processes. And in general, we take a look and see if one entity can use the other systems and processes or the other, and we try to not reinvent the wheel, as a matter of speaking. And in some cases we have to start with a clean sheet of paper. So I'm not sure if that really helps with your question, Sudhir. But that's just based upon our experiences. So that's what we've been going through here.
Thanks, Kelly. And I think we have time for one more question, and this one's for Kelly. Kelly, this is going back to your supply chain map and your very good example about the iPhone. Do you have any advice for future-proofing your supply chain map so it's not obsolete as soon as you draw it?
Well, like I said, it just depends on what you're talking about, because the as I said, it's very easy with to map your tier 1 supply chain, and it's not all that difficult into the tier 2 as well, because the tier 1s you obviously have contracts with, and most of the tier 1 suppliers, at least in the automotive industry, they've got the exact same example where they've got contracts, and we can track their. It just gets exponentially more difficult when you get down to the lower levels of the supply chain, because things are more fluid. There may be a little less discipline in the system of changing from one supplier to another. So, for example, with our suppliers, we don't let them move manufacturing locations on a whim. They have to work with us and get our concurrence to do so and lay out a process and a timeline. I know for a fact that discipline isn't there elsewhere in the supply chain. And as I mentioned during the presentation, oftentimes companies aren't even aware that their products are in one of ours. So I think everybody should take the step to map their tier 1 supply chain. That's always beneficial. And depending upon the industry you may want to do that with your competitors, because you may all find out that you've got one pinch point out there, that if something happened, like we had a few years ago, like a tsunami in Japan and an earthquake, that it could literally shut down the entire industry if you're not careful.
Great, thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Stan, for all of your insights as well. That's all the questions we have time for today. To our audience, if you have any additional questions, you can contact our presenters at the contact information on the screen. I'd like to thank our presenters for their time today and all of our attendees for participating in this APICS webinar. I hope you'll consider joining us at our next Beyond the Horizon webinar on September 15th. Please visit us at apics.org/online events for more information. All content and materials included in this edition of the APICS webinar are the property of APICS and Michigan State University and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved. Thank you again for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.